Hello everybody, this is Connor at BoatsDon'tSink here with another Shadowverse Evolve deck profile. This time we're going to be looking at the Silence Abyss deck from BP05. As with our previous deck, the Destruction Rune deck, this is focused on one of the 10 Omens from BP05, Omens Eternal. They are the cover characters, each of whom have their own sort of lore and backstory and archetype surrounding them, with a very focused sort of strategy in this new set. We're going to be ignoring the 1st and 10th Omens since they are neutral and more splashable packages that can go in any deck, but the other 8 will be looking at dedicated decks built around their support. Last time we looked at Rulenye, the Omen of Destruction. This time we'll be looking at Rulenye, the Omen of Silence. Silence in that your opponent will have no words for you and no cards to play. This is a discard-focused deck. Unlike Rulenye, who focused on the Idolatry trait, and some of the others that'll focus on existing traits, Rulenye's cards all have the Necromancer trait, but none of them actually reference it, and there's very little existing Necromancer support. I believe just a few cards that have the trait, but none that reference it. So instead, we're going to be focusing on the theme of making our opponent discard cards, and surprise, there are some existing cards that do that. There's a few of them. We're not playing all of them. We are playing some of them in this deck, though, to sort of build on the discard theme that we've got going on. As always, this deck is meant to be a starting point. It's still early in the season, and a lot of events this set are going to be more at a local level. So use this as a starting point, make whatever changes you find necessary for your local meta or your playstyle, and go from there. First thing you'll notice is that this deck, similar to the Rulenye deck, has a lot of neutral cards in it. Almost half the deck is neutral, and that is because just a lot of the good generic removal and good generic sort of support cards have become really powerful this set and really fit in with a lot of the control and mid-range strategies. Otherwise, you'll see a few of the sort of Abyss staples, mainly Demonium. The rest of it is all just dedicated discard cards that you really are either from the new set or you haven't seen played in a while. Looking at the Evolve deck, pretty standard, 2 copies of most of our Evolves, 1 Bellringer and 1 of our sort of finisher. As always, you can see the deck log page for this deck by using the code in the bottom right or the link in the description. It's going to be 5V45Y for this one. Our curve is pretty normal. It's a slight bit heavy. We have 8 4-drops, but otherwise, we've got a few 1s. We got a good number of 2s. We cap out at 3 with 11. And then we have 2 5s, 2 6s, and 2 7s to sort of round out the top end of our curve. 27 followers, 11 spells, which may be a little high compared to most previous Abyss decks, and 2 amulets. Another thing you'll notice is that we have basically no Necrocharge focus here. There are 2 cards in the deck with Necrocharge effects, but we aren't playing any self-mill, and we aren't really playing any other ways to fuel those or take advantage of them. They're more just a benefit that we'll get going later into the game, since we are a control deck. First off, we have Bellringer Angel, 1 cost 0/2. Fantastic staple for mid-rangey control decks. It's a ward that can block against early game aggression, and last words can draw a card to replace itself, so it basically lets you stall through the first couple of early turns until you get to your better cards at 3, 4, 5, and so on. It can also evolve for 2 to keep the same 2 effects, but also on evolve deal 2 damage to an enemy follower. In BP05, there are a lot of new aggressive 2 defense followers at 1 and 2 cost that are going to be very relevant in the meta, and having efficient answers to them is going to be super strong and necessary for a lot of decks. For similar reasons, we're playing 3 Angelic Snipe, 1 cost quick timing, deal 2 to an enemy follower. Previously, this hasn't been super great since a lot of decks either just weren't playing followers in the first few turns, or this became useless enough by turn 4, 5, and so on that you didn't need it. However, again, in this format, there's so many powerful aggressive decks and aggressive followers that Angelic Snipe is going to be really important. We also, in this deck, since we're trying to make our opponent discard all of their cards, one of the ways they can play around that is by dumping their hand on the board. If they're dumping a bunch of cheap followers, Angelic Snipe is a way to remove them and get them into the cemetery, which is where we want them anyway, right? As long as they're not in their hand or on the field, and they're in the cemetery instead, we don't really care how they get there. Removal is just another form of discard, essentially. 3 copies of Demonium Punk Devil. This is a 2-cost 2/3. It's basically the most important card in Abyss. It's what kind of made Abyss a more playable class, starting with set 3. It's a ward. Last words give your leader +2 defense. So 2 defensive effects here. We get heal and we get to block attacks. 3 defense is also great on a 2-drop. In addition, it has the activated ability, give your leader -2 defense to gain Bane. This is really important in this deck because a lot of times, you know, you play a 2/3 ward. If your opponent plays a follower and evolves it to swing, it might be like a 4/4 or something, which means it's going to hit your Demonium and live with 2 defense. Giving Demonium Bane, it means that nothing can trade favorably into it. This is especially relevant later in the game when your opponent might be playing, say, like a 6/6 or something to swing at it. And now, instead of living with a 6/4 that you still have to answer, their 6/6 is just immediately 1-for-1, and your Demonium got a lot more value than you paid for. So super relevant, super good, very important to keep us alive against the aggressive decks, but also be able to answer threats later in the game. Or keep us safe from threats later in the game. We play 3 Surefire Bullet. Again, this is just more removal to punish decks for playing to the board, and to answer all of the powerful followers that we've got in this set. So 2-cost quick, deal 3 to an enemy follower. If it's evolved, deal 4 instead. A lot of new good evolved followers this set. Rulenye, which we're playing in this deck, but also cards like Octrice and Catkin in here that have 4 defense. In addition to all the previously existing ones that are still seeing play, Draconeer, Alice, Floral Fencer, Rose Gardener, the list goes on. This answers all of them. Basically every deck is playing at least something that's evolved and has 4 defense, so this being an answer to basically every matchup makes it very worth having 3 copies of. Our other 2-cost spell is Thundering Roar, part of the Rulenye Silence package. 2-cost, choose one of the following. If your Necro charge 10, you'll choose up to 2 instead. So early game, you'll get an effect off of this, and then once you get into the later game, you get to choose both effects and just get extra value out of the card. Makes it stay relevant as the game proceeds. Option 1 is each opponent discards a random card. Option 2 is to deal 3 damage to an enemy follower. Typically, if you're slamming this on turn 2, it's probably going to be to make your opponent discard a random card. Sometimes you just win the game on the spot. Say your opponent, you know, turn 2 Dragon Oracle, and then you go turn 2 Thundering Roar and hit their Dracomancer's rights. Now, all of a sudden, the card they were going to play on the next turn is gone, and the main part of their strategy is gone. So sometimes you just win the coin flip and win the game as a result. Other times, you just put your opponent behind a card, or you trade 1 card to make them lose 1 card, which it's a 1-for-1. But if the card that you hit is better than your just random removal spell, then you got value, right? If you make them discard something that the 3 damage from this couldn't have answered, you got more value than this card was worth. And that's kind of how we're trying to win the game, is just by outvaluing our opponent. And we're playing some ways to, you know, get more value out of our cards than our opponent. The 3 damage mode on it obviously isn't as good as Surefire Bullet, but there are still some relevant, like 2-drop 2/3s that see play. Servant of Disdain is going to be popular in the Dragon decks this set. Fashionista Nelcha and Marvelous Sunday in Forest, and Demonium Punk Devil, which we play in this deck. 3 damage will answer any of those on turn 2, so still decent enough for that if your opponent is trying to commit to board. Moving into our 3 drops, we have Crazed Executioner. This is our 3-cost 3/3 that evolves for 1 that I mentioned. However, he does not evolve into a 4/4 like most of them. He actually just evolves into a 3/3. On evolve, deal 2 damage to your leader. Select an opponent, they reveal their hand. Select a card in their hand, the opponent discards that card. If you've played Magic the Gathering, you will be familiar, for better or worse, with the card Thoughtseize. This is effectively Thoughtseize that has a 3/3 body tied to it. Thoughtseize is a very powerful card. This is a very powerful effect. I've heard some people say that this card's not as great in this deck, using the reasoning that if you're trying to hit a critical mass of discards to put your opponent to 0 hand anyway, this card dealing damage to you and costing 4 play points is essentially the least efficient way to make them discard a card to get them to 0. But while that is true, I think this card is actually very powerful for other reasons. If you're playing this early in the game, turn 3 going second, for example, being able to pick the card that your opponent was going to play on the next turn, instead of making them randomly discard, you're always hitting the best card and the card that slows them down the most. So you're getting really more than one card's worth of value. Because say you do that, discard their 4-drop, and their next turn is now all of a sudden like Bellringer Pass, or like 2-drop Pass. You've made them waste play points, you've slowed down their strategy, just all of this stuff that's very powerful. And is going to help you get into a stable position where you can sort of ride out the rest of the game and continue whittling down their hand and running them out of options. Next card we play is Lyriel, Archer Throne. This is a new 3-drop from set 5. It's neutral. 3 cost 2/5, which is fat butt, very hard to kill. Basically forces your opponent to use premium removal like Serpent Wrath, Ivy Spellbomb, or Witch Bolt to deal 5 damage to it for 3. Quick timing. Engage this card, deal 2 damage to each enemy leader. It's a very powerful effect. It basically means that Lyriel A has Storm, and B gets to attack at the end of your opponent's turn. You can do this on their end step. So Lyriel will remain reserved all through their turn. The opponent won't be able to attack Lyriel unless they have a sail. And then at their end step, you can engage her, deal 2 damage to them, so you're still getting your attack damage in effectively. The second effect is just as relevant. While this card is on your field, your leader does not take ability damage. So you'd think a lot of decks right now, you look at Rune, they have Truth's Adjudication or Demonic Strike to deal damage to you. They also have the Destruction in Black Amulet won't be able to damage you. Dragon, the discard decks won't be able to hit you with Dracomancer's Rite. Galmu won't be able to hit you with her effect. The Fable Haven decks won't be able to deal damage to you with Tin Soldier or Humpty Dumpty's Evolve effect, or Explosion. So Lyriel is fantastic against a lot of relevant decks in the meta right now. But there's actually even more hidden text on this card. Not only does it stop damage from your opponent's abilities, it also stops damage from our own abilities. So the Crazed Executioner Evolve, not going to deal 2 damage to us. Path to Purgatory, not going to deal 3 damage to us. Soul Dealer, not going to deal 3 damage to us. Which means we get to play a bunch of sort of overstated cards that are getting us a ton of value without having to pay the downside of dealing 3 damage, or dealing however much damage to our leader because of Lyriel. So very relevant both against other decks and for making our own deck function better. 3 copies of Rulenye, Omen of Silence, our boss monster for the deck. 3 cost 3/3. Fanfare, Necro Charge 10. Select an enemy follower that costs 3 or less on the field and destroy it. Again, not something you're going to be getting like immediately when you play this guy, but later in the game, it adds an extra line of text to him. It means that the 3rd copy that you can't evolve, because we only play 2 evolves, still has text on it. And there's some relevant 3-drops that you would want to hit later in the game. Ones that are, you know, kind of hard to answer otherwise. Lyriel that we just looked at with the 5 defense and ability to stay untapped all the time. Prime Dragon Keeper gains Intimidate later into the game, so this is a good way to answer it. And just cards like Apostle of Repose that have a lot of defense for their stat line. It evolves into a 3/5. Being able to answer those without having to worry about using your other effects or like damage removal is just really powerful overall. Especially since these are all cards that, while they are 3-drops, they are still relevant in the late game, and your opponent would still want to be playing them in the late game. The other effect on Rulenye is, while this is on your field, any spell an opponent plays costs 1 more. So, big thing here is removal spells. It's going to make your opponent's removal spells cost 1 more to answer your followers. Angelic Snipe and Surefire Bullet are huge this format, and almost every deck has some number of spells that it's playing in some capacity. Even decks like Sword that are more follower-focused are playing cards like Avaricia and Usurping Spineblade, and maybe even Surefire Bullet on top of that. Generally, it's not going to prevent your opponent from playing the spell, but making them pay 1 extra for it could really mess up the rest of their turn. Say, for example, your opponent was going to play Surefire Bullet and a 2-drop, Now they're having to pay 3 for Surefire Bullet, which means they're probably just passing with an extra play point up that they don't get to use, which means you're effectively unramping them or whatever, which is just as powerful in the long term, disrupting their strategy, making them keep their cards in hand to not get value out of them, and then we just make them discard the cards so they never get value out of them. So really good there. It also makes it really awkward for them to answer our board sometimes, especially cards like Lyriel that are going to require that higher costed, like 3 and 4 cost removal anyway. Making them pay even more is just really annoying for them. It's going to buy us a lot of time to, again, stabilize and get in a position where we can rip their whole hand out. It's also pretty powerful against Merlin, specifically. On Evolve, she allows you to play a spell from your cemetery for 0. This makes them pay 1 on top of that, so they have to have an additional play point to spend in order to get Merlin's On Evolve effect. This also applies to various other things that let you play cards for 0 or reduced cost, such as Craving's Splendor from EX area with Guild Release in play. Your opponent still has to pay 1. Anything like that. So kind of funny in those scenarios. Not really the main purpose we're playing it, but it does just hose those matchups a little harder. Rulenye evolves for 1 into a 4/4. On Evolve, each opponent discards a random card, and then he still has the spell effect. Discarding the random card is not as good as Crazed Executioner on 3+1, but still really strong. Can still just hit the card you wanted to hit anyway on a coin flip, or just lowers their hand size. Usually you're going to want to see Crazed Executioner on the earlier turns, and then Rulenye on the later turns, where you're getting more value out of the Necrocharge fanfare effect, or where your opponent's hand is already so small that a random discard is essentially always the best card in their hand anyway, because they only have like 2 cards. But yeah, fantastic card. Really strong, and it's not bad if we draw this as like our turn 3+1 play and evolve it early game. Even if it's a random discard, the spell cost increase effect is still relevant enough. It's going to slow our opponent down. It's still a 4/4 that can punch them, so still a great card. Our last 3-drop is an Amulet. It's the only Amulet we play in the deck. Path to Purgatory. It's a card that hasn't really seen much play since set 1. It didn't really see a ton of play there. Fanfare, draw 3 cards, deal 3 damage to your leader. So, as we said with Lyriel, this can be prevented. So if you have Lyriel in play, you just get to draw 3 cards for 3 play points, which is incredible value. And it's a great way to refill our hand after 1-for-1ing our opponent a bunch and making them discard a bunch of cards. So now we get to keep playing the game and they don't. The second effect on this, at the start of your end phase, if your leader's defense is 6 or less, engage, put this into Cemetery, deal 6 damage to each enemy follower on the field. So this is generally a board wipe. 6 is a fantastic number. Your leader's defense just has to be really low. So this is, in the late game, basically a way to stop your opponent from being able to flood the board and come back with too many things for you to answer. Or if they just draw like a Storm follower and hit you down to sub 6, you can crack this to blow up their board. And it basically puts you in a position where you can spend your whole turn doing proactive things instead of reacting to their board, and just let the Path to Purgatory answer it for free, so that now they're on the back foot and have to answer your board instead of killing you, or else they're going to die on the following turn. You can also, if you don't have Lyriel, instead of waiting for your opponent to hit you down to 6 or less, you can use effects like Crazed Executioner or Soul Dealer to deal damage to yourself to try to put yourself to less than 6. Path to Purgatory's own fanfare will also get you there if you have like 9 defense. It'll put you down to 6 just by playing it. So you can use it to draw cards, and then maybe play some of those cards, and also board wipe your opponent for pretty cheap. Moving into our 4-drops, we have Apostle of Silence. This is a 4-cost 4/4. At the start of your end phase, select an enemy leader. If they have 3 or less cards in hand, deal 3 damage to it. This is basically our way to punish our opponent after we've already discarded all of their cards or made them spend all of their cards. Now they're in a position where they either have to choose, do I continue spending cards to try to keep up in the game and lose 3 life every turn because of it? Or do I try to hold extra cards in hand or draw extra cards to go back to 4 or higher so that I'm not taking damage? but in that case, they're not really affecting the board as much anyway. So really good card, puts your opponent in sort of a catch-all situation where like neither play they can make is fantastic. And 4/4, not great stats on its own, but it does evolve for 1 into a 5/5, which again is going to require premium removal. Can be really annoying if you have Rulenye in play to increase the cost of that removal. On evolve, select an enemy follower on the field, deal it 3 damage. Just playing this on curve, turn 4 going second, 3 damage is fine. It's probably answering something, and then you can swing the 5/5 body at whatever else. However, if they have 3 or less cards in hand, you destroy that follower instead, which is great in the late game once you've already sort of run your opponent out of cards. This prevents them from top decking just a giant answer that can swing the game back in their favor and take over. That could be a card like Israfil or Ryo, where they're going to gain defense, be able to board wipe you. Ryo essentially draws 3 cards. It's going to put them back in a little bit, but if your answer can just be like, oh yeah, I'll just like pay 4 for an Apostle of Silence, evo it, destroy your guy because you have like 1 card in hand, or 0 cards in hand, and then also burn you 3 again and have a 5/5 that you now have to answer with your 0 cards, and we killed your giant guy for free essentially. So really good late game card to just sort of finish out the game, burn your opponent those last bits of damage, and start hitting in for 5. And then of course it also has the same burn effect that the base form has. Next we have Soul Dealer, a 4-cost from set 2. This is a 4-cost 6/5, which is an enormous stat line. It also has Ward on top of that, which is kind of just absurd when you read all the text on this card, like all 2 words of it. The downside to those giant stat line and Ward is Fanfare. You have to deal 3 damage to your leader. But guess what? If we have Lyriel Archer Throne, we don't have to take that 3 damage. This is also a really good curve going first. Even second, it's fine, but first especially, you get to play Lyriel on 3, play Soul Dealer on 4. You don't have to deal the 3 damage to yourself, and now you just have like a ton of stats in play. He evolves for 2 into a 7/6, which is even more stats. Still has Ward. On evolve, select an enemy follower on the field, destroy it, give your leader +X defense. X is the selected follower's attack. Once again, this is really good at just clearing giant threats and benefiting off of it because you're gaining a lot of leader defense. It's supposed to basically like counteract the 3 that you had to take by playing him and make up for that once you evolve him, since it costs so much more to also evolve him. Like, say you play him, you take 3, you evolve, you kill like a Floral Fencer, you gain 4 back, so you're net +1 still. Or sometimes later in the game, you know, you'll play him, take 3, evo, kill a Genesis Dragon, and you're like net +7 or whatever. However, if you didn't take the 3 in the first place because you had Lyriel in play, this is just straight healing. And it can make it very hard for your opponent to kill you if you're just like gaining 5 defense randomly out of nowhere while you're killing their guy and putting a 7/6 in play that they now have to answer. So this is just really powerful card overall. Works great with the rest of our deck. Even if you don't have a Lyriel, it is a big stat line that's hard for your opponent to answer, and it's even harder for them to answer when they have so few cards in hand because of all of our discard effects. Silent Purge, 4-cost spell. Select an enemy follower on the field and destroy it. Its controller discards a random card. This is not quick timing, and it can only hit followers, so it's not quite like an execution, but it still fills that slot where it's just like blow up a follower. Good for the same reason as Apostle of Silence or Soul Dealer. We can hit anything, so this is good at answering just tall threats and preventing our opponent from making a comeback after they sort of like top deck a really good card. And it makes them discard a card in addition, so this is just always a 2-for-1. I originally had this card at 3. It was kind of the 41st card that I had to cut down to keep us at 40. But really powerful card, really good 2-for-1. It's just a little expensive. You don't particularly want to draw these early in the game since it costs 4. It's just better late game to sort of clean up and keep your opponent from being able to come back into the game. Moving into 5, we have Dark Angel Olivia from set 2. 5-cost 5/5 Fanfare, choose up to 2 of the following. Option 1, gain an evolution point. Typically not something you're going to be doing unless you're trying to like turn 8, play this and a Rulenye in the same turn to rip out like all of your opponent's cards. Option 2, give your leader +3 defense. Good for sort of like stabilizing against more aggressive decks, especially if the first, like, say turn 2, turn 3, turn 4 are them playing followers and you having to answer them. Once you've kind of run them out of cards that way by playing Angelic Snipes, Surefire Bullets, Demoniums, you can do this to gain some defense back if they got in some hits on you. Otherwise, if you've spent a lot of resources, you can draw a card instead. Option 3 is just draw a card. That will probably be one of the two that you're picking the most, since, again, we're 1-for-1ing a lot with cards like Thundering Roar, or cards like Angelic Snipe or Surefire Bullet. Lots of 1-for-1s, so we need to draw more cards than our opponent to make up for it. Option 4, each opponent discards a card. You're pretty much always choosing this one in this deck. Obviously, the goal is to keep our opponent as close to 0 cards in hand as possible, so making them discard with Dark Angel Olivia is going to help us with that. She's also a 5/5, does die to the premium removal, but forces them to use it, and is hard to remove otherwise. Moving into our 6-drop, speaking of hard to remove, this is arguably like the hardest card to remove. Dark Alice, 6-cost 6/6 Rush, so it can swing at enemy followers the turn we play it. Strike, each opponent discards a card, benefiting from that Rush to immediately get the strike effect the turn we play it. And last words, banish the top 10 cards of your deck, put this follower onto its owner's field, discard a card. So she's recursive. If our opponent kills her, we can just banish top 10, discard a card, bring her back. Sometimes you do that the same turn you play her. You just like crash her into something and then banish 10, bring her back, swing again. So your opponent has to discard 2 cards and you either kill like 1 giant thing or 2 smaller things. Really powerful card. It also comes up to where, like, if your opponent answers her during their own turn, you banishing the 10 puts her back into play on their turn. So you untap and can immediately go face with her on your next turn. So she's just very hard to answer. She's going to threaten a lot of damage if they don't find like a way to banish or bounce or top deck her or whatever. And she's going to keep forcing them to discard every time she attacks. They get to choose the card, but hopefully by the time she's coming down, they have so few cards anyway, that they're just like discarding the only card in their hand, then it doesn't matter that they get to choose. So really good way to close out the game. And another way that we have to close out the game, Lucifer, a card that really hasn't seen much play outside of the dedicated Angel decks since set 1. 7-cost 6/7, Ward. Start of your end phase, give your leader +4 defense. So this is another really good way to stabilize in the late game if you're just trying to buy a little more time. Especially if you have a card like Apostle of Silence or Lyriel just kind of like burning away at your opponent and you just want a way to stall out. However, he can also evolve for 0 into an 8/7 with Bane. At the start of your end phase, deal 4 to each enemy leader. This gives you the option of, like, you can play him, heal, and then on the next turn, evolve, swing 8 at your opponent, burn them 4. Or you can just play him and immediately evolve to burn them 4. And they have to answer an 8/7, or you get to swing 8 next turn anyway. He's 7 defense either way, so it kind of just comes down to whether you want the heal or burn immediately on that first turn. Then he's always dealing 8 and burning on the second turn, pretty much. That will usually kill your opponent. The goal is that a 7 defense follower is too hard for your opponent to answer after you've already been making them discard cards the entire game. It's kind of the same thought as like Soul Dealer, even Olivia and Dark Alice. Once you get to that point in the game, if your opponent's had to discard all their cards, they're not going to have answers, and you're just going to very quickly kill them with whatever sticks on board, and that is kind of our win condition in this deck. So one thing to keep in mind when you are playing this deck, looking at the cards, a lot of decks now are actually leaning towards going first, because having a turn 1 play is so important, and just getting on board and pressuring your opponent is so important, as opposed to previous formats where a lot of decks would like to go second because evolution points were so strong. And there are still some decks that want to go second now. It's not like every deck wants to go first, but I believe more of them do. This deck definitely wants to go second. Not for the evolution points, but because your opponent does not get to draw a card on their first turn if they go first. That essentially means we're already starting a card up, or they're starting a card down. Not only does it mean that their hand is smaller and easier to rip all of out, but it also means that we have an extra card to spend 1-for-1ing them. And if we say 1-for-1 4 of our cards in hand for their 4, they now have 0 and we still have 1 to kill them with. So very powerful to go second with this deck. You do also get the Evo points, which means you can turn 3 Crazed Executioner or turn 3 Rulenye, and do some of the other stuff a bit earlier as well. But yeah, in general, you do for sure want to go second with this deck. Some of the pros of the deck: you have a high density of discard effects, which means you'll always be able to sort of keep the opponent's hand empty, ideally. You have a large removal suite to answer decks that try to dump their hand early to avoid your discard. You have Angelic Snipe, Surefire Bullet, Thundering Roar, Silent Purge, lots of removal spells. So you're kind of hitting your opponent whether they play or don't. It's no real escape from it. And we have some hard to answer endgame threats. As I said, a lot of our guys have big defense lines, but also cards like Dark Alice, which are self-recursive, and even if our opponent has an answer, they have to have a second one as well, because she comes back. And another pro that I don't have here, but like I mentioned it when I talked about Thundering Roar, sometimes you just play the 2-drop that rips out the best card in your opponent's hand and they don't get to play the game because of it. So sometimes you just hit like a random 20% or 25% on turn 2 that effectively wins you the game on the spot, and that's a great option to have. It doesn't feel very good for your opponent, and it doesn't feel like a whole lot of competitive integrity, but it can win you the game for sure. Some of the cons of the deck: it basically comes in the territory of discard decks in every game. Sometimes your opponent just top decks the answer. Putting them on 0 hands does not stop the top card of their deck from being a Genesis Dragon. Things like that. Your opponent will have ways to come back, or they will be able to just top deck the answer. Even if you Crazed Executioner them and get rid of the best card, they may just draw another copy of it. And random discard effects are random, of course. They are weaker than selective ones. Sometimes you might just hit the cards that don't matter, and your opponent gets to play like normal anyway, just with a smaller hand size. And at that point, you still have a fully functional deck, so you're not out of the game, but it can be a bit harder when your opponent's not playing completely on the back foot. Another look at the whole list here. Again, as always, you can check out the code 5V45Y to see the deck log page here. Lots of neutral cards, lots of silence cards, lots of discard effects. I think this deck is really cool, in the sense that I think it's really cool if I'm playing it, and I absolutely never want to sit across the table from it. I have done that in the past week, and it's miserable. Evo deck, pretty normal. And as always, thank you for watching. We'll have some more videos out soon. I'm going to try to keep these videos on the Omens rolling, though I will probably, you know, splatter some other non-Omen decks in between just to keep things exciting. So yeah, there should be some videos on the screen if you want to check out. Until next time, and I will see you then.